I've got all of the videos going from 2018 all the way up until this year, looking at all the different times they've talked about space stations, how they wanted to build them, what they wanted to do with them, what the challenges and plans were, and we're going to go through all that today. This is one of the very first times they have ever talked at all about space stations. I think this was after their first introduction. I couldn't find the very first introduction, but this is just talking a little bit about what space stations were supposed to be when they were first bringing them in.
And here we see work that the procedural tech team has done recently on various libraries.
The procedural generation, varying color schemes go a long way, along with varying, obviously, the shapes.
Sticking with the rest dots, here's a look at recent testing the procedural feature team has done on the approach to stations like this from a pilot's perspective.
Okay, so that's a first look at the space stations, and then they jumped. This is a few months later, so they didn't introduce the space stations yet, but then we got another look more at the interior of them. So what we're about to look at here is back in the day when they were first making these space stations, they were actually making them mainly by hand, not completely by hand. They were building this procedural layout tool at the same time. So like the process of building them was not as fast as what they can do now. And this is where they're going to kind of talk about how that process went of making that system work while also building the stations.
The reason we developed the procedural layout tool is that we need a lot of locations, plenty of variation throughout the entire universe of Star Citizen. And to do that, we couldn't do it manually, so we needed a smart procedural tool to achieve this goal and do the work.
The key requirements for this procedural tool was to ensure that the art team didn't have to learn a new set of rules and change drastically their workflow. We wanted to be able to control placement, tinting, branding. We wanted to be able to say, make adjustments to an existing area. How much effort is involved in doing that? So user experience is key, and from that, we should be able to create a larger variety of environments with minimal effort, and therefore populate our universe quicker.
So like they were already scaling up at the time. The stations were nowhere near this size when we first got them. So that's kind of, they do this a lot where they work on something for one thing, whether it be caves or underground facilities or space stations, and then they bring that work over to the other stuff they're building. So like the space station tool got used for HABs, as you can see. It also got used for caves, interestingly enough. The Mighty Bridge tool that they use for space stations, which we'll go over in a little bit here, is also used for caves on the ground, which is strange. So first thing that we're kind of seeing when they're building out these space stations is they're focused a ton on the modularity. Of course, that makes sense. You got to have modularity with space stations, but they built a ton of them, a lot of them, more than I think most of us feel like we see regularly when we're going to space stations. Everybody, I think, agrees that they feel quite different right now, or sorry, quite similar to each other right now. So let's continue to step forward from here, January 10th, 2019, into more of the discussion that comes around how they want space stations to work long term. And then we can contrast that to see how it's compared to what they were doing at the time, because there are some differences here. Let's listen in.
Going off of the kind of the parameters, the boundaries that we've been established to sort of talk high level, what's the sort of initial flavor? And you know, we got some of the questions down here. What's the sort of experiential difference going to be between these? Why would someone choose to go to one brand over another? Do our existing brands work for these? Which is actually kind of an interesting thing too, because you know, we have a lot of companies as it is, and it's easy to kind of go like, oh, we'll come up with something new, but at the same time, like, that's not necessarily the best way to go, because it's like, as opposed to we have hundreds, if not 1,000 companies like in creation at the moment. So like, why
the corporation matrix?
Okay, that kind of shows how much detail they go into, but they get into some more interesting topics here, I think.
All kinds of ventures, including rest stops. Like you could see something like a hire company, like, okay, we want to build the greatest rest stop in the world. We're really trying to innovate. You've seen some of these rest stops in the world that look like Apple stores, in some ways. And then you see the smaller companies. Lower end can be a smaller, more independent company that's just trying to get into the rest stop game. Well, and it's not about being run down. It's just they don't have the money for a lot of the amenities and a lot of the features.
I mean, or conversely, it could be a really major company that's just like, we're just going to spend as little money as possible to turn as much of a profit as possible. Yeah. So it's like, they again, like it's exactly, it's that thing where it's not necessarily this is a dingy, dirty, broken apart thing. It's just, it's cheap and not built with care.
Clearly they're talking from a super narrative perspective. And that's really important when looking at a conversation like this. What these guys are talking about, they are the writers. They're the ones who set up what the world is going to look like, but they're not putting it in the game. They quickly got rid of this old model that we were looking at with these interesting designs, and started to move towards much more diverse designs at a larger scale, and that's what we'll get into here. So this was the first look they were giving us at this new expansion into space station diversity they wanted to do. Let's take a look.
We've been looking at increasing the variety and sort of complexity of our space station exteriors in terms of their shape, and basically make our space stations look much more diverse when you first approach them. So the first thing to do was take the concept. We took the concept, we had a look at those, and breaking those concepts down into what would be conceived of like asset sets, and then we're talking about how to stitch those assets together in a modular way. So we would take that first and sort of piece them together by hand to make sure all the assets that we're going to build would work with one another. And then it's a case of taking those into prefab libraries and setting them up to be used with the procedural system. Basically, it's the beginning of fully putting the space stations into a procedural system. Next comes interiors, and then marrying those two things together. And that gives us the ability to go away and then create things like cargo and refinery stations as well.
And we're going to literally, everything that he just said, we're going to watch play out over these videos. They're going to start with these exteriors, show us the differing variety. These are the space stations we know, so I won't focus on that too much. Mainly just the way that they're building them out modularly, and then the way that they're going to bring in interiors and eventually bring in different types of specialty decks.
Basically, it's the beginning of fully putting the space stations into a procedural system. Next comes interiors, and then marrying those two things together. And that gives us the ability to go away and then create things like cargo and refinery stations, as well as just the rest stops, but all in a completely procedural way and all fully integrated with one another. So we should see output in terms of like locations for these sort of what we call secondary, like our landing zones are a little more bespoke. These are kind of more secondary locations, but we want a lot of them because they're kind of going to be the bread and butter of the player experience, and we want them all to look different in some way, and we can only do that using a procedural tools.
If you missed what he said there, he said that they want these to be like secondary locations to cities. Clearly what we have from these right now are so far from what they're meant to be. Just looking at how underground facilities are changing with probably 4.0, maybe a patch earlier, and how they're going from like these really basic bunkers that we all know and hate at this point, and they're turning them into like these multi-layer, multi-room, massive cavernous areas with different functions and lobbies and all this stuff. You can tell they're expanding based on the gameplay that's starting to be involved and looking for better ways to make use of these spaces. I think these are going to expand in the same way we're seeing UGFs, but let's keep looking at how it expands from here.
A new sort of expansion of our sort of procedural space station locations. So for this release, for 3.6, we're looking at updating the exteriors, so they should be a lot bigger. They'll be a lot more fun to fly around. They'll be more diverse in terms of where the hangars are positioned, where landing pads are positioned, but you're not going to see much in terms of expansion for the next release. That comes in the release after, when we're looking at updating the interiors as well.
Very first look at the expansion to space stations at the time, that was around summer of 2019, so again, this is before we ever got the space stations that we know now. It's funny to like look at how long Star Citizen's development is. People talk about how it's been 10 years, yada yada, all this stuff, and then realize how much of that actually happened in the last 3 to 4 years to recognize that things actually have been speeding up. That was our very first look at those new stations. Now we have a little talk here with Todd Pappy, where he just kind of talks a little bit more about these space stations and how they're going to work.
What we're working towards in the future is building out the space station so it has, let's say maintenance area or gravity room, power room, so on and so forth. So like all these kind of utilitarian aspects that would go into a building or into a space station.
That is resource network. I don't think I have the clip here, but there is a point at which Jared asks a question to one of the people working on space stations and slips in. Oh, no. It was the engineering video that we saw earlier this year. He mentions to him, hey, space stations are going to have resource management. How is this all going to work? And this is kind of Todd doubling down on that idea that, yeah, all those maintenance style, engineering style rooms that you might need in a space station for it to run, same stuff we'll see in landing zones, spaceships, outposts, all that stuff. They'll be in space stations too. So there will be space used up for stuff that will likely be used for missions. But I wonder how much use there would be outside of missions when it comes to those
kind of utilitarian aspects that would go into a building or into a space station, and then hubs, for the employees that live and work there. And then there's basically the social areas that we have right now. So when we go into like 3738, we're trying to build those three sections, and so every station that we'd be putting out would have those there. Some of them would be able to be accessed, some of them wouldn't be able to be accessed.
No, that didn't happen.
But they would still technically be there, and so that allows us to have parity across the board. So if we do something where it's a station that's living and breathing and working, just think of it like a building. If you go into an office building, a lot of times there's security there, and you can go into, let's say you can go into the lobby, but you can't go into the whole building. Versus if the building is a derelict, then you can go in through the whole building and check it out.
Or if the space station was a derelict. Sorry. We saw kind of the exterior rework of these space stations, and Todd Pappy talking a little bit about what they want to do with the interiors, and then we finally are able to see some game dev stuff. This was actually like a full hour of him just working through space stations, the interior is kind of what they were doing to update them with props and stuff. And, you guys have seen plenty of these Star Citizen lives. I mean, you guys recognize all this, right? I think it's really important to note that these were the new spaces at the time, yeah. I keep remembering the older space stations having really low ceilings. And these weren't much of a change from that, in my opinion. All right, here's some more talk about the new space stations from the interior side. This was fall of 2019. Let's see where we were at that time.
We obviously wanted some new interiors to match those. One of the big challenges with working procedurally is that you deal with libraries of things like rooms and libraries of props that are all separate from one another and then get pieced together. And what often happens during development is that you don't see a final layout until quite late in development.
We are going to hear about the solution to that problem. Might not be a solution, but I think something that at least makes that problem a lot better soon. TM.
Which makes producers and directors a little bit nervous because they're not sort of seeing an end result till reasonably late. But when it is all set up, when all those filters and rules are all worked out and figured out, the end result is like a much more expansive set of layouts all the way through the development. What the new stations give us now that the existing stations didn't is scale, but also variation between the stations as well. So generally, every station you went into felt the same. Now we'll have things where the elevator rooms sometimes come off the hub, sometimes come off the view room.
The thing is, we got diversity. Like, he's not wrong, but we really only got diversity in that you'd go into a station and instead of the burrito place being over here, it was over here, Like, there's still just not enough art assets or services in this game to have actual diversity. And since they didn't do as much on the design side, we just really don't feel it that much. Clearly, the goal is that these stations are diversified, but they have put these space stations on the back burner. Like, everything that they've been designing up until now started to go towards Pyro like a year and a half to 2 years ago. So of course we're not seeing any updates to space stations outside of what Montreal did with the med clinics and the different modules, which we'll see later in this. But it's why underground facilities have been the same for multiple years and are only just getting updated. It's why outposts have been the same for multiple years and have only just getting updated. It's why ships and the way they work haven't had components and are only just starting to get updated, because so much of this stuff has just been held back by the team needing to do other more important stuff. I bet whoever has been building space stations had to go and work on space stations and Squadron for a while too.
They will all fall within the same category of rest and relax, sort of utilitarian art style. So they're not.
That is also something they keep focusing on, saying these are all rest and relax, rest stop space stations. They're very clearly drawing a distinction between a rest stop and a cargo station and a refinery station and so on and so forth. The problem, again, being that cargo stations feel like rest stops. Refinery stations feel a little bit different, but even then, the basics are still all the same. November of 2019. So this is right after CitizenCon 2019.
The introduction now of the, or soon to be, of abandoned rest stops. Mm-hmm. So, Kovalek's going to.
See, now, when you start saying like stuff like that, Luke, my ears go, huh? Abandoned stations? Let's listen to more to what he has to say to that.
So we're taking the rest stops, and the abandoned ones have not only the bit that players can walk around, but they have a workers area, huge, and lower decks. Mm-hmm. So you can imagine an abandoned one of those that you get to like walk or EVA or whatever around. Will provide us with so much scope to do a huge investigation mission with so many arcing stories and the building block system that we have. I think we've talked about it before, but like having like kind of an email system or something, so you can actually go and log on and kind of flick through the history and see if there are any bits that stand out. That'll just lead you on investigations.
That's definitely, that's a really good insight right there. First, he's confirming for us very much that derelict space stations will be a thing, like the Kovalix one, as somebody pointed out. Obviously, Kovalix is handmade, so it's bespoke, as they like to say. But eventually, they'll have to make abandoned content kits of space stations and a lot of assets that people can use to create these mission locations. And then we also see on the other side of things with the mission features team that they are working on investigation missions, and they're building them in modules so that they can be applied to things like these space stations. So I thought this was a pretty good confirmation of things like abandoned and derelict space stations. A short one, but it was there. This is just on the Pillar Talk, so we'll just get a couple of words on it here, but they'll talk about it a little bit in the following videos.
Yeah, just the overall size of them, the visual difference between them, the hub sizes that are in there, the way that we procedurally generate them. We've got HABs, we've got Elroys, having them in low orbit around planets.
So they'll basically be a sort of geosynchronous station that will be for each one of the major planets. So you don't have to go all the way down to you can go there, you can save in orbit versus having to go all the way down the planet.
And also certain people that have certain ships that will not be able to land on planets.
They can go there, yeah.
Yes, they can go there and then obviously get transferred down.
Okay, that was a very quick update. I really wish they had mentioned something about cargo there, but they did mention at least that ships can't be transported down. Now, after interiors were done, they started to talk more about specialized stations. And this brings in, I think, the most important period of time regarding space stations, the lead up to cargo decks. If you were paying attention, you knew that cargo decks weren't going to bring gameplay. You could tell from the descriptions and everything that they had that cargo decks were just a location and nothing else was going to be done with them. But we were all so, I don't want to say naive. We were very excited for how things were going. This was right before COVID hit. And we were just very excited for a solid, fun 2020. And I think a lot of people were hopeful that the cargo refactor would be following within a year of these cargo decks. So when they came out, it was, well, why don't we just look at how they started to build them up first?
You may have seen in the vault over the last 2 weeks images of work being done on new cargo and refinery expansions to the modular space station system. Seen here, currently in white box phase, the modules are more than just exterior variations, but will also provide new opportunities for exploration and gameplay within. Now, while this isn't scheduled to come online in Alpha 3.9, it's a fine example of staggered development in action, with developers and teams working on tasks scheduled across multiple releases.
I don't know what this is going to be, but he's probably talking about cargo decks.
We'd started work on a couple of new spaces for the space stations. So the cargo shop is a little different from the shops which have been kind of like a single purpose shop. It's kind of a one-stop shop for all your cargo needs, and it'll have a small commercial area for retail purchases with possible sort of guild discounts available. Then there's a small administration area and also a small area to sort of eventually rent cargo specific ships as well, and potentially, like going forwards, cargo containers and things like that.
They were talking a lot about the things that cargo decks would be used for, and they all make sense. Buying cargo, getting cargo supplies, moving cargo around. But it was kind of like, is there actually going to be any different? Like when these things came into the game, I kid you not, you never had to go to one for cargo gameplay. You still don't have to. You could just go to the admin office, I think, for all that kind of stuff. So this whole area is definitely going to have a lot bigger difference at some point, probably when the next version of the cargo refactor comes out with the cargo freight elevators. But when they first came in, these were meant to be something that diversified and specialized space stations, and they just did not. From there, they talked about the refinery decks, which was the other thing that was specializing stations at the time.
Over this quarter, we've been following along with the early development of our upcoming refinery decks, and we're here now with another look at current white box, gray box look dev. The refinery decks are meant to occupy a separate space within the rest stops from the more commercial areas. These are where players come to handle their more industrial needs, from refining mined materials to picking up mining related missions, or even buying new mining equipment. One of the larger elements of these locations are the blazing heat generated from the open smelting facilities and blazing slag being poured into vats.
The refinery decks are still some of the best atmosphere in the game. The loud speakers and the sound effects, the lighting effects, when NPCs are actually moving around, the worker people. Refineries are pretty well done. But again, it's a lot of space and not much stuff going on there, whether it's missions or what have you that they might want to put in there to update the space. Just having a simple kiosk for going in there refining is just not enough yet. This clip actually that I'm about to show you, we'll start to see more of the little things that are going to start to come in space stations in the future. So here is one of the interesting things that they actually did introduce to us to as a feature coming to space stations, and then never mentioned it a single other time after this one moment.
Up in the space above our corp and throughout the Stanton system, concept artists are working out new EVA access hatches for space stations to support the upcoming EVA missions intended to take players out onto the surface of these mammoth structures for investigation, repair, and potentially even combat. We'll learn more as the feature develops.
And the feature never developed. Those are the kinds of things that they have stopped talking about. These are the types of things that we would normally be getting in a sprint report at some point throughout this year, but I think they are just done with the reactions they get to features like this that get shown, that get talked about, and then don't show up quickly because it pisses people off. It makes people very angry. And that starts to bubble up in comments over and over. Hey, you showed this, where is it? You showed this, where is it? You showed this, where is it? And clearly things will get worked on. They realize, hey, we're not going to be able to do those EVA missions. So then these people say, oh, okay, well then why would we need EVA entrances? And they stop working on the EVA entrances, not because it's their fault, but because somebody else had to switch their tasks because they can't do EVA missions. Maybe because EVA wasn't good enough, maybe because AI couldn't back the EVA missions, maybe because space stations didn't have enough going on to, say those missions should happen. But this is a very clear example of something happened on another team that caused whoever was going to be working on these to not work on them, whatever features were going to be followed up to not be followed up on, and we never heard about them again. Moving forward from there, this was also around the time that we were getting gas clouds.
Come online in the upcoming Alpha 3.12. These particular clouds are designed to add color and texture to the various rest stops found throughout the Stanton system. Now that the parent and child gas cloud tech is ready for implementation, the lighting team is on deck
currently working to dial in the specific palette so that clouds closer to the sun appear warmer and those that are on the outer reaches present cooler. Lighting artists are also currently working
more
to
space
place
station
the
stuff.
various key lights, secondary lights, and shadow casters for the upcoming Refinery decks.
So
Work also
there were actually a lot. Oh, there's more space station updates. Look at this. We're getting treated today.
Continues on fleshing out the docking area add-ons for existing space stations throughout Stanton. With this look at some of the work being done on the interior areas players may find themselves in when they arrive. Now this sprint was all about adding in details like branding, the docking services area, what's behind the docking services area counter where you're not supposed to go, secondary details along the floor like parallax occlusion mapping, and an observation deck where players can wait for their friends to arrive or just watch the big giant spaceships come in.
Okay, so a lot of things going on with space stations in 2020. We had gas clouds getting worked on, we had refinery decks coming in, and we had docking collars being a thing. That was actually a pretty big feature at the time. It was really the first time I think I had ever seen something like that in a game. I know there are games where you can connect ships together, but the ship-to-ship and ship-to-station docking in this game always impressed the crap out of me. It just sucks that it's basically been implemented as an alpha example and not really branched out to other more useful implementation or applications yet. All right, now another touch on the docking collars that we just looked at, some of the development going into those. Again, this is now 2021, we're moving on a little bit.
Those who have already jumped into Alpha 3.13.1, currently available in the public test universe, know that ship-to-station docking is coming, along with Invictus Launch Week later this month. And here you can see some of the final lighting passes being done for the various rest stop and security station docking areas. Now, I haven't seen this yet, so I'm just gonna watch along with you.
All right, here's more talk. This is actually talking a little bit from the perspective of Montreal. So something big happened in December of 2020, maybe. They opened a new studio in Montreal. Okay, they kind of co-opted Turbulent. I think they bought out part of Turbulent and essentially became partners in development on Star Citizen. Turbulent is the team that's been working on Spectrum. They worked on the website at first. They started to work on persistent entity streaming and server meshing after a while. And they also have a locations team. When I say this locations team is the cream of the crop, folks, I'm talking about the cream. All kinds of stuff, hospitals, stuff that all came in right on time when it was supposed to, even before expected at times. And it's always done pretty well. And it's been introduced with things like missions and other functionality. So Montreal generally, when they get their hands on stuff, does a good job.
The goal for them is to build up a solution that's really oriented around layouts. Our first proof of concept is space station. So how can we help the workflow for the space station for artists and designers to build them more quickly? The second phase will be looking into developing rules in Houdini so that the Houdini can actually generate layouts and for those layouts to be then edited by a person, and at least on the space station and maybe then in some caverns or locations like that we can actually give more gameplay to the player without sacrificing any terms of quality.
And then we started to get more into talking about Pyro space stations. This is when we finally got to learn more about how space stations are going to differ if they are not coming from rest and relax places. Not necessarily touching on Port Olsar and Seraphim Station and what's going on in Stanton, but more talking about the future with derelict space stations and outlaw-owned space stations. We'll kind of skip around this section just to listen to some important parts. It's a pretty long section, so I don't want to make you guys sit through all of it.
There's sort of older infrastructure built to sustain kind of the mining activities and the gas harvesting and stuff like that, but they just basically left, and then other populations started to slowly move into the system, criminals, squatters, survivors, and whatever, and start to kind of take over what was left behind.
Which gives us some unique gameplay comparatively to Stanton and the space stations there. So with Pyro, since they're in such disrepair, some of them are inhabited, some of them are completely abandoned, and then so the players can go and explore, They can go and see what's happened there, whether it's been hit by an asteroid, or if it's there was some sort of conflict there before. But you'll be able to go and explore the different decks, and be able to go and meet new people, meet the frontier lifestyle, enjoy it.
Before we really started exploring anything, one of the core concepts that was discussing as a group was the idea of power and the idea of heat. Now, we've got like this big interior layout of this, maybe this old mining station. How would they have adapted the space? You know, they would have, right, okay, we need power here. Okay, that will create heat. So we started thinking about, okay, where would the heat lamps be? And then where would light come from? So just the principal concept of power, creating heat, creating light, that was pretty much the core of the start of the visual development process.
So when we started talking about it from a design side, we needed to make sure that we were covering certain shops, just basic needs for the player. Everything's bare bones. It could be that it used to be a clothing store, now it's a food shop, and so they've converted it. The gangs moved in. You know, it's not what it used to be, and but you see that old skeleton there.
So this is kind of looking at the actual creation of these space stations, and you'll see how they have differed a little bit in how they look, but ultimately the stations themselves, if they were made new again, would look a lot like the ones in Stanton.
What I have here right in front of me now is obviously the food court from our Stanton space stations. We've just dragged the wear up on all of them. So now we're getting all of this really nice grime on all of these surfaces, right?
Ooh,
so if
good
I turn off
grime.
my working lights, which hopefully are gonna, you know, produce that mood that we're after. So I'll turn on that right now. So a number of things have happened right in front of us, right?
Definitely gets a creepier vibe than the stations we have now. Honestly, with some good music and the actual risk of AI being a problem here, I think it looks pretty nice.
We have a couple of design constraints within this space as well. One of those being we have a gang and then a general civilian population, right? Now, one of the things that we wanted to do in terms of that design in this particular space was separate it out in like a kind of class type system, right? So we're going to start to explore some of the requirements of that.
See, this looks complete. I can't tell where this would be in the space station. It looks completely different, even though it's the same space we're used to. As long as they can do enough to create that sort of feeling across the space stations as a whole, I'm with it. All right, let's see how far he pushed it.
We've got these little portable ones lighting up the place. We've got some ones that are hanging from the roof, ones that are over in the corners and stuff like this, right? So we're starting to get a lot more mood in this. This is starting to feel really nice now.
At the end of the day, this looks so much better. It feels kind of claustrophobic, but I think what's really going to sell this is the AI. The people walking around in here, the sound of chatter, people actually shopping and exchanging things. Like, we need so much more of the general AI behavior to come through with obviously better server tick rates and server meshing and all that jazz. It's really going to go a long way to make these places feel better. This is just another game dev situation where he is able to talk a little bit more about the work that goes into these places.
We want to figure out where the limits lie before we start making guarantees and cashing checks with directors and stuff like that, right? So when we're looking at like specifically the physics stuff, part of that is the expense of it. How much can we get away with within the environment itself? And also just the general stability of it.
Imagine a scene like this in a finished game. Like, they could do some really cool narrative-based stuff in here. The lighting, the vibe, the atmosphere, it looks really good. This time last year, a little bit earlier than this time last year, so I'm guessing we're still starting to just see the benefits of that come in. But here's some explanation they give towards Mighty Bridge.
One recent example of a tool we developed is the Mighty Bridge.
Mighty Bridge is a plugin for the game editor that link the game editor to any other software.
Right now, the main usage is to be able to work in Houdini and have some effects directly in editor.
With the Mighty Bridge, the communication is done in two-way direction. It can send information and ask stuff to Houdini, for example, and Houdini, while doing the computation, is able to say, okay, you want to place a cave here? Give me all the objects in this 50 meters radius so that I can adapt the recipe and then send back the result. And with other technology, you don't have that two-way communication, so it's also help us doing more complex recipe and adapt the content to the game level.
The reason why the Mighty Bridge is important is there's a lot of technical resources and knowledge in all kinds of amazing tools, like, as I mentioned before, Houdini. And by providing a way that artists can interact with the editor from the tools that they know and love and have learned to use over many, many years, they can make more easily the stuff that they want.
There's no time in between of like thinking about the logistics of everything. It just like does it for you.
We made the Mighty Bridge thinking about the future, so that if we want to use other technology, we can plug them into the editor using it. And for example, if we want to use Blender or 3ds Max or Maya or Substance Designer, for example, that we are using, but if we want to plug them into the editor, we could use Mighty Bridge to do that.
Okay, here's another change they made. This was around last year's time. Very, very short mention, but something that obviously has caused a lot of sadness in a lot of people.
Adding additional hangar exteriors for rest stops, enabling the addition of more small and medium hangars for ships to these locations, and the ability to summon and store a greater variety of spacecraft along the way.
So that's probably in part because they need to instance hangars to load in ships in an immersive way, and they can't just have them popping up on pads, but it's also because padramming was a problem for the entire history of Star Citizen. A great way to ruin somebody's day would just be to have a ship fly it into somebody else's ship while they're landed and blow them up. I wish it wasn't a reality. I wish there were defenses against it, but for the most part, it seems they are assigning hangars now as your alternative. And you're right, pads aren't gone, but ships won't spawn on pads anymore, and stations won't guide you towards pads. Now, we don't know if that's going to move or change in the future, but it is something that exists with space stations now, and it has changed the way they've designed space stations to get around it. This is just going to be a nice look at Outlaw space stations from a strictly art-based perspective. We're not going to get any gameplay here, but this is kind of the latest sizzle reel we have on what these newer space stations are going to look like. This last shot, because you can see like the little shanty towns that have grown up on the outside of space stations where they don't have enough places for people to live. I do hope that a mission requires you to go here to like interview somebody or talk to somebody or just like be there to get something. Finally, we have a talk here briefly with Montreal where they get asked a question where they don't necessarily answer that well. I mean, I understand they didn't have the answer or didn't know that they could have the answer, but there's a question here about derelict space stations, and we've heard about them before, so we know they're coming, but I really was hoping that Montreal would have something to say on this.
Any discussions about derelict space stations? just going one bigger, an entire broken down, run down space station. Not like Ruin Station, which is still in operation. It's just, but like a old and empty derelict space station, or maybe even a crashed space station.
Yeah,
they've been discussed.
Yes, we're talking about it. I don't remember the name. Is the
So you can kind of see, like they all exchange looks here. They all kind of look at each other like, wait, what are you about to say? Right there. Wait, hold on.
Oh, Port Olsar?
Port Olsar.
Port Olsar. Yeah, sorry. Thank you. We were talking about maybe we're going to crash Port Olsar on the planet somewhere eventually.
But for now, I don't think this is a mandate that's going to be on us. And if it is, it won't be for now.
Port Olsar, crashing it somewhere, and basically using that as an in-lore way to send off from it. And I believe, actually, I said that was last, but we did have one more talk about Port Olsar here. So let's listen to what they were saying here.
Seraphim Station is the official name for what we've been calling Olsar 2.0 internally for quite a while now. What we initially set out to do is to create this really grand space station with a really fantastic sense of scale that players could have a really good time flying in and around and also to and from. So we had a really good time playing around with different design languages and shape languages that we could then use to come together for the final product. We were also working on lots of shape studies involving the silhouette of the station to make sure it was reminiscent of other stations and also to bring our own unique spin on it. There's multiple hangars, view rooms all over the station, providing you with beautiful views of the planet at the right time of day. Extremely large station, probably 4 to 5 times bigger than Olsar. So we have everything that you could possibly need inside. It has various sets of hangars and habs in the center of the first 2 rings.
Everything is, like, nothing is changing on the interior from what we know. All of these rooms are the exact same. So, like, this is the exact same room as from the other stations. We're not getting that diversity that they've been talking about all this time with this station. It's just not happening, and it's not going to happen for a while, I think.
Then towards the back end of the ship, we have the cargo area, which is going to incorporate that gameplay as well. So this is how we sort of mixed and matched all of these together to create something a little bit more unique. We also have docking tubes and everything else that players could need to traverse along this big structure.
It has the medical clinic areas, it has cargo, everything there that's needed to support all of our careers that are being developed and growing.
The whole need for the station was that we're trying to have a focus on and introduce bounty gameplay into each station as much as we can. So each station also has a security dock integrated into it as well. That is going to be where all of the bounty gameplay is going to be happening, and you're going to be directed towards that.
I don't know how I feel about this yet. It makes sense that you're going to the security dock for bounties, but it almost feels like there should be a special hangar on the security dock for bounty hunting specifically. That brings us to kind of the point of this video. Port Olsar, I think, embodies the entirety of how space stations have changed from 2018 when we were first getting them in the PU, at least in 3.0, to now, 2023, where we're kind of in the middle of fleshing them out. Since they are building them in stages with these utilitarian ones in Stanton and now the outlaw ones in Pyro, we'll probably end up getting something like high-tech in Terra. Maybe we'll see Henoism in Castra. Possibly we will see some Streamline in Nyx, or maybe some more colonialism in Nyx. But clearly they're coming in waves, and Seraphim Station is the end of the wave that we're currently in. This feels like they are closing out utilitarian style. They've got it figured out. They are caught up in terms of gameplay systems. They've got security deck, food, docking, like everything that we have been introduced to in terms of gameplay has been added to this station. For the future though, we're seeing different styles, different styling, different types of stores and branding, upkeep levels. We're seeing stations that are only going to be for fuel, some stations that will be probably just for bounty hunting. We're seeing derelict space stations that will occur in Pyro and probably also in Stanton, outlaw space stations that I think we will see in places like Stanton as well. At some point, Grimhex will have to be replaced, and it will likely be replaced by an outlaw space station that has asteroids incorporated into it. But all of these types of things we've looked at are going to end up in Stanton in some way at some time. And right now we are just sitting in a pool of monotony when it comes to space stations. I don't think this is how they're going to be for much longer, next couple of years maybe. This has been a little talk, a little look into the history of space stations, how they got to where Port Olsar is, why it's leaving, and what we might get in the future. Catch you all next time.